Projection of male complex and core of distortion of nature, earth and humanity. The fall of woman in the Garden of Eden. One of the most well-known religious narratives in Christianity is the story of Adam and Eve. In many Christian interpretations, Eve's role in tempting Adam led to original sin, and this has been used to justify the subordination of women in both religious and social contexts. The idea of women as the temptress or source of evil became deeply embedded in Christian theology and led to the marginalization and subjugation of women for centuries. The exclusion from religious leadership. In many Christian denominations, the idea of male priesthood became a cornerstone of doctrine. Women were largely excluded from leadership roles within the church, which reinforced a hierarchical power structure that denied women spiritual authority or the ability to contribute meaningfully to religious discourse. Women were often confined to roles of nurturers, mothers, or wives within these systems. Witch hunts and persecution. During the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, women were often targeted as witches in religiously sanctioned persecutions. These were often based on superstitions, fears, and patriarchal control, with thousands of women being tortured or killed under accusations of witchcraft. This was driven by both religious authorities and social control mechanisms that sought to eliminate women who were perceived as threats to the established order or who didn't conform to traditional roles. The historical context of Christianity's development. The development of Christianity within the context of the Roman Empire is pivotal in understanding how it has shaped societal structures, including the treatment of women, slavery, and the devaluation of life. Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century under Emperor Constantine. Prior to that, Christians were persecuted. Once it was institutionalized, however, Christianity became deeply entwined with the power structures of the empire. Early Christianity was often in opposition to the Roman Empire's imperialistic, authoritarian practices. This led to Christians being viewed as rebellious and countercultural. However, once Christianity was co-opted by the Roman Empire, it adapted to serve imperial interests, aligning with the Roman political structure and reinforcing the idea of obedience to higher authorities, especially to the emperor and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The crucifixion of Jesus was presented as a form of sacrifice and divine truth, a powerful narrative, but it also became a symbol of control. Jesus' death was tied to a dominant narrative about obedience and sacrifice, often used as a moral justification for subjects to accept suffering even under oppression. Over time, Christianity became institutionalized in such a way that its moral teachings were often twisted to justify the status quo, such as slavery, oppression of women, and the exploitation of labor. You're asking about the treatment of women, particularly within the context of Christianity, and how the narrative of the crucifixion and Jesus' betrayal by Judas was used to justify power dynamics. Women as property. In many religious traditions, including early Christianity, women were often treated as property rather than individuals. The idea of women as incubators, essentially as vessels for reproduction, is an unfortunate truth of many patriarchal systems. Christianity, especially under early Catholic doctrines, reinforced the idea that a woman's primary role was to be a mother and wife. The medieval period and Renaissance saw the restriction of women's rights, especially in religious contexts. Women were often excluded from leadership positions in the church, and sexual autonomy was severely restricted by religious doctrines that linked women's bodies directly to male authority and control. St. Augustine, an influential Christian theologian, for example, argued that women's inferior status was a result of Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. This influenced the belief that women were inherently more sinful and required greater control. Women as livestock and commodities. In early Christian teachings, women were sometimes depicted as commodities within marriage, an institution primarily designed for the protection of male inheritance rights. Women's social value was often seen in terms of their ability to reproduce and serve the family. These patriarchal structures extended into secular law, where women were often treated as the property of their fathers or husbands. Marriage was often a business transaction, where women were traded or given to men. This was reflected in both Jewish and Christian practices of the time, where the dowry system reinforced the idea of women's worth being tied to their reproductive and domestic labor. Judas, the betrayal and fear of death. The betrayal of Jesus by Judas is a cornerstone of Christian theology, and you bring up an interesting point about Judas taking the money in fear, possibly to avoid the same fate as Jesus or to escape his own sins. Judas's betrayal of Jesus is often understood as a symbol of human failure, but there's a more political angle to his actions. The 30 pieces of silver that Judas receives for betraying Jesus can be interpreted as a symbol of corruption and greed, a reflection of the monetary manipulation that has often been associated with power structures, including the Roman authorities and the later church. Fear of death and self-preservation could have been major factors for Judas. This fear of death is a critical aspect of human nature that gets manipulated for power. Those in power, whether Roman authorities or later Christian institutions, used the fear of death to control the masses, teaching them that suffering is divine and that the end of life would be rewarded, even as those in power exploited people's fear of mortality for their own benefit. The consequences of this historical manipulation are still evident today in multiple ways. Control through religion. Many religious institutions continue to wield power and influence over societies, reinforcing traditional gender roles and maintaining systems of inequality. Religious teachings, whether from Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, have been used to justify oppression, sexual repression, subjugation of women, homophobia, racism, and economic exploitation. The legacy of slavery and exploitation. The justification of slavery and economic exploitation has been deeply embedded in Western societies due to religious and imperialistic power structures. Slavery in the New World was justified by Christian doctrine, where the enslaved were often dehumanized and denied basic rights, all in the name of religion and civilizing missions. Wealth and power. The link between religion, wealth and power remains as strong today as it was during the rise of the Roman Empire. The rise of capitalism and corporate structures often mirrors these ancient patterns, where wealth accumulation and economic control have been justified through manipulation of religious narratives. Your reference to the mafia and the modern-day parallels to historical power systems is also crucial. Exploitation of labor, economic inequality, and the dehumanization of individuals can be seen in global capitalism today, where the value of life is often reduced to economic output or monetary value. The mafia and corporate interests often operate by the same principles of fear, violence, and manipulation, offering people money in exchange for their obedience and subjugation. Conclusion: historical evidence and consequences. The evidence you're looking for is embedded in the very fabric of history and continues to play out in the world today. The abuse of power, exploitation, and control of women, labor, and marginalized groups has been justified through religious dogma, imperialistic expansion, and economic manipulation. The consequences of this manipulation are still visible today in global economic inequality, gender oppression, and political corruption. These historical patterns of religious justification for oppression continue to influence societal structures and are reflected in the ongoing struggles for justice, equality, and human rights.